When people compare ancient China and Europe, they often start from a modern endpoint and work backward. Europe becomes the place where modern science, industry, and global power eventually emerged, and China is judged by why it did not follow the same path. That approach sounds reasonable, but it quietly distorts the picture. It turns history into a single road with a finish line, and assumes everyone was running toward the same destination. In reality, ancient societies were trying to solve very different problems, and they solved them under very different conditions. For much of history, the central problem China faced was scale. How do you govern vast territory? How do you manage populations that even in ancient times numbered in the tens of millions? How do you keep order, collect taxes, move grain, and prevent local power from tearing the system apart? Europe, for a long time, did not face that problem in the same way. Political power there was fragmented, kingdoms were smaller, authority was layered, negotiated, and often unstable. That instability caused constant conflict, but it also meant no single system carried the full weight of an entire civilization. China did. By the time China unified under the Qin, it was not experimenting with unity for the first time. It was taking a long process of centralization and pushing it to its limit. The Qin state replaced inherited privilege with law, standardized writing and measurements, and imposed uniform rules across an enormous population. From a purely technical perspective, this was astonishing. No European state at the time could even attempt something on that scale. But the Qin experience also reveals something important about how advancement works. The system was extremely effective at doing what it was designed to do. It mobilized labor, enforced obedience, and crushed resistance. It built roads, walls, and administrative networks at remarkable speed. What it did not do very well was slow down. A system built for absolute control leaves little room for negotiation, adjustment, or exhaustion. Once pressure built up, there were few places for it to go. So when the Qin collapsed, it did not collapse because its ideas were crude or backward. It collapsed because those ideas were applied too completely, too quickly, and without much margin for human limits. That distinction matters. What followed was not a rejection of the Qin model. Later dynasties kept much of its structure. Centralization remained, bureaucracy expanded, standardization continued. What changed was tone, pace, and flexibility. The Han did not dismantle the machine. They learned how to live inside it. This pattern shows up again and again in Chinese history. Institutions are built, tested, strained, and then adjusted rather than abandoned. The goal was not endless experimentation, but long-term stability. Over time, this produced a society that was remarkably effective at administration. Officials were trained, records were kept, taxes were systematized, infrastructure projects were planned across generations. This is where comparisons with Europe often feel lopsided. For many centuries, Europe simply did not have equivalent tools. Power was personal. Law was local. Literacy among elites was inconsistent. China, by contrast, developed technologies that quietly reinforced large-scale governance. Paper made administration cheaper and faster. Printing spread practical knowledge. Agricultural innovations supported dense populations. Canals and roads connected regions into a single economic system. At the same time, this kind of success carried its own consequences. A system that works does not feel urgent. It does not constantly push its own limits. It encourages refinement rather than reinvention. Europe's experience was almost the opposite. Because no single authority ever fully stabilized the continent, pressure never disappeared. States competed, they failed, they copied one another, they tried again. Ancient China was not standing still while Europe moved forward. It was solving a different problem, one that Europe would not fully face until much later. And when the world began to reward speed, disruption, and repeated reinvention, the balance naturally shifted. not because one civilization failed, but because each had already learned different lessons and carried them forward.